Tonight on Nation to Nation, fighting for the falls. The battle over a hydro development continues in Labrador. Trapped by consultants, Barriere Lake continues its struggle against the yoke of third-party management. And the political panel weighs in on what's needed to change the department's policy on financial intervention. This is Nation to Nation. I'm Jorge Barrera. We begin this evening in Labrador. 28 people who call themselves land protectors are facing criminal charges after occupying the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric site. The protectors say the project threatens to poison their land and country food with methyl mercury once flooding begins. 4 people went on a hunger strike in protest. Then the province and the Indigenous leaders of Labrador struck an agreement that seemed to satisfy all sides. Not so, say the land protectors, who plan to continue the fight against Muskrat Falls. Joining me now is land defender Kirk Lethbridge. Kirk, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
So Kirk, you're one of 28 land protectors that are facing charges as a result of last fall's Muskrat Falls protests. What are you facing? What are the charges that you're facing?
Well, the latest criminal charges are criminal charges for costing, I guess, the project money. I forget the exact section of the criminal code, but apparently when we were shutting down the project, when we occupied the camp, that's what they're trying to pin on us.
And now that you're, ensnared in a court, in the justice system, in a court process, are you worried about whether you could face jail time or probation?
I think it's a concern to some folks, but I don't think it's a grave concern. I think we have a bigger concern, and that is the toxic chemical poisoning of the Grand River Mississippi, what you call the Lower Churchill. I think our biggest fear is the end of a way of life and a bay that's 90 miles long, and all the seals and fish and waterfowl and shellfish and that will end up in the food chain.
So you do it all over again, even though you're facing charges now?
Yeah, I'd do it all over again for sure.
Now, the president of Nunavut recently wrote a letter to the Premier of Newfoundland urging him to get Nalcor, which is the provincially owned utility that is behind the Muskrat Falls Hydro Dam project, to drop their charges. I guess they're the ones who pressed charges against you, and the RCMP is executing them, and now you're in a court protest. How do you feel about the fact that your province is basically going after you for this?
Well, I'm not surprised that they would. They have a vested interest in all the contracts that the province has signed with the SNC Lavalin and Nalcor and the whole Estaldi and all of these huge multinational corporations that came here to dam this river. It's very interesting to note that we will not even be able to light one light bulb, Jorge, off of this so-called project that's so good. We won't even be able to light one living room with one light bulb. We're basically getting nothing out of this but a huge hydro bill and toxic chemicals and the possibility of drowning from the North Spur collapse. And we're getting a runaround on a lot of lies. So, we could not depend on our Aboriginal leaders or our MHAs or MP. So we had to take action ourselves. We got tired and we got backed into a corner, and we had no choice but to take action. And it's looking like we still have no choice. And writing letters right now, that's fine. We'll accept that letter, and hopefully there'll be more letters and some action behind those letters instead of just words. We want to see some action. A year ago or less than a year ago, Joanna Slamp and Todd Russell and a few more were looking for our support to make sure that there was a total clear cut above stream so that there wouldn't be methyl mercury poisoning. And instead, we fought and we protested and we put ourselves on the line to go to jail. And meanwhile, these guys went behind closed doors and made a deal behind our backs, behind the people's backs, behind the Aboriginal rights backs, behind the non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people's backs. And they made deals to flood and destroy this land. And we have not forgotten this. And a few letters is not going to change that we're going to need to see a little bit more than a few letters. They wanted a full clear cut, and that was the only thing that was acceptable, and that's still the only thing acceptable to us.
So are you going to, what are you planning more protests? Like what's your next step?
There will be more action, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to, give us an update on what's happening and to tell us about, the criminal charges you're facing. I guess the price you're paying for trying to stop this flooding, and we'll continue to watch those developments unfold.
Well, Jorge, it's very interesting that the same Aboriginal leaders that asked us to go to rallies and so on and stand up for what they believed in are the same ones that left us and made a deal behind closed doors and left the people hanging, old people and children facing jail and prison and things like that. So it's not acceptable for us, especially under Aboriginal culture and law, to have one chief go and make a deal for 5,000 or 10,000 people. That's not the way that we do things, and we're going to see those things change in the coming years here in Labrador and hopefully across the country, because I understand it's happening all across.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Kirk.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll talk again. When we return, fighting the consultants. Stay with us. This is Nation to Nation. I'm Jorge Barrera. Barriere Lake and Algonquin First Nation in northern Quebec never signed a treaty or extinguished rights to their traditional territory. But for over a decade, they've been under the control of a consultant hired by the Indigenous Affairs Department to run its finances. The community is one of the poorest in Canada and is in desperate need of housing. Yet the department has paid third-party managers in Barriere Lake millions of dollars. Barriere Lake is pushing back. We get the latest from the community's senior administrator, Tony Wawatie. Joining me now is Tony Wawatie. Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Ori.
So Barriere Lake has been in the news a lot lately. You guys, Barriere Lake, invited a group of human rights observers to go visit the community to check out firsthand the state of things, and you also appeared before Parliament's Indigenous Affairs Committee, where you told MPs about how third-party management, which essentially means that the department has a consultant running the community, is actually hurting Barriere Lake. What is the message that you're hoping? What is the change that you're hoping to trigger through this full-court press that you've launched?
Well, one of the things now, our community members are very running out of patience to be stuck in this situation for over a decade now. And I know that in 2006 they imposed a third-party manager in our community, and ever since then we've been stuck in this situation without an exit strategy. So and that's something that we want to make sure we take steps to get out of third-party management.
And you also took Ottawa to court over, the performance of your third-party manager. There were instances of checks bouncing. What is the status of that court action?
Right now, it is true that we were taking the federal government to court, because of the dissatisfaction that we had with third-party management, and the lack of reporting requirements that that they're supposed to be doing. But the fact is that they want us to sign on this consolidated audit, and meanwhile, we have a problem with signing it off because the chief and council is not signatories to these agreements, and right away, just by that, there is a problem in that process. But we do have a plan to get out of our situation. We hope that we can get that done fairly quick. Last week we did stand in front of a standing committee on this default prevention and management policy, and we shared our concerns to the committee about the lack of accountability and transparency on the part of third-party management and the federal government. How can we always hear about the accountability and the transparency, but they should be accountable to our people.
And I want to talk about the trilateral agreement just quickly before we go. I mean, this trilateral agreement, this agreement was between Quebec, Ottawa, and Barriere Lake. And my understanding is that the former Liberal Indigenous Affairs Minister was called Indian Affairs. Back then, the former Indian Affairs Minister, Robert Nault, under a Liberal government of Jean Chrétien, just walked away from the trilateral agreement because it didn't fit their models of what these sorts of agreements should look like, right?
Yes, that's correct. And one of the things about the trilateral agreement was the common sense, approach for our community, and it was an approach where it was supposed to be a sustainable development approach, and which was completely outside of the land claim comprehensive approch, where we don't have to extinguish our rights and our title. We've done some studies that that prove our existence and our identity. And one of the things that that is strongly rooted is that we do have a constitution, and we do have our Unapinigewin, which is our customary laws, which we codified to try to meet what the Canadian government wanted at that time. It's there, and we wanted to, we have our system in place.
AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde has written the Indigenous Affairs Minister, current Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett, for a meeting to meet with you. Bellegarde wants the minister to meet with Barriere Lake. Have you heard anything from the minister's office yet?
We haven't heard anything from the minister's office, but we did send out a letter earlier today requesting an urgent meeting with the minister. Since their election in 2015, we haven't met with the Minister of Indian Affairs, and that's something that we're still encouraging the minister to, and the federal government, is to come back to the table so that we could honor and respect the agreement that they signed.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We've asked the minister's office to respond to this letter to see if they will meet with you. So we will continue to watch developments at Barriere Lake. Thank you so much for joining us, Tony.
All right, thank you very much.
Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett's office told us after this interview that they won't meet with Barriere Lake while court mediation is ongoing. When we return, the political panel discusses third-party management. We'll be right back. This is Nation to Nation. I'm Jorge Barrera. The Indigenous Affairs Committee has been studying the issue of third-party managers for the last few weeks. So what needs to change when it comes to financial management for First Nations? Joining me now is Yvonne Jones, Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Affairs. Cathy McLeod, Conservative MP, is back. And Rachel Blaney joins us again from the NDP. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For this final political panel before the Easter break. You guys get 2 weeks off, get to work on some constituency issues. We're going to talk about third-party management. It's been a going concern before the Indigenous Affairs Committee for a few weeks now. And as we all know, Barriere Lake has also held a press conference, and there's been issues around their push to try to get out under almost over a decade of third-party management. Yvonne, I'm going to start with you. I mean, this is an issue that your government is aware of. I'm just wondering, what are you guys looking at? Is this an issue you're looking to change, the policies or the way that this is done, third-party management?
Well, obviously, the minister have taken tremendous interest in this file. We have currently in the country about 12 First Nations that are under third-party management. However, there are more than 50 that are under co-management, and we want to make sure that they're not going to slip into third-party management. We've not been happy with the process. It seems like it's a cumbersome process. It's taking a long time for some of the bands to move away from it. The minister has engaged in discussions with First Nations about other options and ways that the government could move forward in partnership with them. We're happy that the committee, the Standing Committee of the House of Commons, is now studying this issue, and we'll look forward to see what their recommendations are going to be.
Now, Kathy, you've been at this committee, you've been hearing some of this testimony. Is there something that's jumped out at you, or is there a theme that's developed, or is there a particular problem that you think is sort of, you know, the core of the issue around this?
I've had conversations with former ministers that were under our government, and they did have concerns about this whole program process. So we don't always agree with the government, but in this case, I think to have the committee have a look, to be able to make recommendations to government is certainly consistent with what we were going to do. You know, I think the issues that I think I hear consistently about is you get into this third-party management, and there's no motivation to, you know, support, build capacity, capability to move on. And so I think, you know, we've heard that loud and clear. We do have to have structures in place that are going to support communities that are struggling and finding themselves in challenges. But it's, I think we agree that there can be some better solutions, and I certainly look forward to recommendations that we're going to put forward.
Rachel, just jumping off of what Kathy mentioned, you mentioned about, you know, there's no incentive. But perversely, there seems to be an incentive for these consultants who are hired to help run band finances to stay, because the longer they stay, the more money they make. I'm just wondering what you make of that structure.
Well, I think what we have to do is get down to the root issue here, which is addressing that very structure, where companies are coming in and making a tremendous amount of money. There's no incentive for them to move on from this. And this is also something that is a long-term history in this country of not building that nation-to-nation relationship. You know, when you look at some of the testimony from the committee, you'll hear people talking about the lack of funding, the reality that they're trying to serve communities that are very remote. These things all add up, and you see that numbers haven't changed. So, you know, we come back to this funding, and numbers haven't changed, communities have grown, and the resources aren't there for them to do the services that they need to do. And in some of the testimony, it's squabbling between two different accountants about what, you know, what's this and what's that. And then, you know, you have communities going into this third-party management. So, you know, it's really about how are we going to help people move forward, how are we going to work with people in a positive way, and how are we going to change the fundamental root, which has been a long-term issue in this country, of treating Indigenous people like children.
Okay, well, I want to play a clip from the committee this week, and I just want you guys to react to this.
When I talk to my wife, as I say, she's Brazilian, but it's very similar to First Nations, Indigenous peoples communities, that corruption becomes a part of culture. You do not know the difference from right and wrong.
Now that was Stanley Barriere from the Indigenous Management Group. He's from Peguis First Nation. You know, his consulting firm is Indigenous run and led. They have a former INAC bureaucrat working for them. But anyways, how do you respond to what he says? He says there's a culture of corruption at the band council level.
Well, I'm sure that there are lots of examples across the country where there has been financial abuse or mismanagement within bands. You know, there are many documented cases within INAC, and some that are still ongoing and under investigation. Whether it can be perceived as a culture, you know, I guess that's debatable. What I like to rise up is the number of bands in this country that have been successful and have very strong leadership and have been moving forward with good fiscal management practices. And there are many more that fall in that category than fall into a category of being investigated at this stage. Is there work to do in terms of ensuring that bands have adequate access to the financial resources they need to run properly? Yes. Is there a need to build capacity in a lot of the First Nations across the country to invest more in education and governance level supports? Those are things we recognize as a government that are necessities, and those are the areas that we will focus on and have already started to focus on. We've already invested in this budget and last budget to be able to deal with those capacity and resource-based issues that they need.
Now, Kathy, one of the things he also talked about, he's talked about there's no code of ethics at the band level. I think that was part of his testimony. I mean, you were there. What did you make of what he had to say?
I found it to be a little bit shocking what he actually said, and you know, I don't doubt that it's his experience and his framework, but certainly from, you know, my experience, my framework is we have to make such a blanket statement to sort of suggest that across the country this was a culture issue. I found actually is not true in terms of any experience I've ever had. You know, some of the testimony that also came later, though, for me, you know, our national chief sort of talked about the issue, and I think he talked very eloquently to it. To me, part of your ability around finances, financial structure, third-party management is also around transparency to your community members. And I keep hammering on this one because I think he says, well, you know, there's elections, and if people aren't happy, they can make other decisions with their leadership. If the band members don't have access to basic information in terms of audited statements, chief and council salaries, how they're spending their money, how will they ever make decisions around their leadership? So, I mean, I know the national chief talked about, well, transparency, we care about transparency, but, you know, really elections can take care of these issues. Band members need access to information, so transparency goes part and parcel with building capacity. You build capacity for your leaderships around these areas. You build capacity for community.
Transparency Act. Yeah, you've been picking that bone with the Liberals since they decided to back off the court.
But they're connected. Yeah. They are connected.
Change is coming. Change is coming.
Rachel, what did you make of what Stanley had to say?
Well, it's such a. It was shocking, and you know what I feel is unfortunate is that Indigenous bands do not hold the record of being the only place with corruption. Corruption crosses the board, across all cultures, across all countries. So let's be clear about this. This isn't about a culture that's evolving within the Indigenous community. This is about some people are corrupt and some people are not, and we need to address those issues, and that's absolutely true. But again, the concern is when you look at his statement, what I would say is that there's a poverty culture in some of these communities, and when you have long-standing intergenerational poverty, things happen. There's a real impact to poverty to people, you know, and I think we need to start addressing some of these issues. We know that there are still Indigenous communities that don't have running water. We know that there are still Indigenous communities that are in third world, fourth world standards. We need to be addressing some of these issues, and we need to be making sure that as we're addressing them, we're doing it in a respectful way that allows all members of the community to have a voice. Telling them they have to do it this way or that way, I don't agree with that. I think it's very important that we work in those communities and that we're supportive and those communities lead the way. That is what Nation to Nation really means.
Okay, well, thanks so much. That's all the time. You wanted to say something quickly?
I just want to make sure that you're not connecting third-party management to any kind of wrongdoings within band councils. Most that are in third-party management are there either because they didn't have the tools they needed at the time, or they're underfunded to be able to meet their obligations, and that should be noted as well.
And it should be noted that he's from Peguis, and I'm actually working on a story about.
Yeah, I mean, it could be very well his experience.
Peguis has some issues that I'm going to be reporting on soon. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us again this week, and 2 weeks break coming up, and then we'll get you guys back here. Happy Easter.
Same to you.
Well, that's all the time we have for Nation to Nation this evening. Todd Lamran will be in the host chair next week. I'm Jorge Barrera. Good night.